was certainly an element of making my grandfather proud and honouring him by taking part in the award that has been so much of his life's work. And I definitely hope that I have made him proud.
In the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, as the world watched public ceremonies, state visits, and carefully staged royal appearances, something far more private was unfolding behind palace doors. Decisions were being made not for cameras, not for tradition alone, but for legacy. Quiet decisions, personal decisions, the kind that never make headlines immediately, but eventually reshape the entire meaning of inheritance, loyalty, and family within the monarchy. And at the center of those decisions was not the most famous royal, not the most outspoken, and not the most publicly visible. It was someone many once overlooked entirely. Lady Louise Windsor. To understand what happened with the Queen's private jewel collection, one must first understand what those jewels truly represent. They are not just gold, diamonds, and historic gemstones passed from one generation to another. The crown jewels belonged to the nation, bound by law and tradition. But the Queen's personal collection was different. It was intimate, emotional, carefully built over decades of gifts, heirlooms, and symbolic pieces that marked moments of love, duty, and memory. This was not just inheritance. This was identity. And when a lifetime of personal treasures begins to be redistributed, it is never just about value. It is about meaning. It is about who is remembered, who is trusted, and who is chosen to carry the invisible weight of legacy. In the royal world, silence often speaks louder than announcements. For years, speculation surrounded the final decisions of the Queen's private estate. Experts suggested there would be structure, hierarchy, and tradition guiding every choice. The Queen Consort would naturally be first in line for significant pieces. The Princess of Wales would follow. Other senior royals would be considered based on duty, visibility, and public role. But beneath that expected structure, something more personal was unfolding. Because Queen Elizabeth was not only a monarch, she was a grandmother, and in private moments, far from official protocol, she made choices that reflected emotion more than obligation. Among those closest to her in those private spaces was Lady Louise Windsor, not the most public royal, not the most politically significant, but someone who, according to multiple royal observers, held a quiet and deeply personal place in the Queen's heart. There were no loud declarations about favoritism. There never are, but patterns tell their own story in royal life. Time spent together at Balmoral, private conversations away from public duty, trust given in subtle ways that outsiders rarely notice, and most importantly, access to a world very few are ever allowed to see. One of the most symbolic examples of this was a reported moment when Lady Louise was shown private artistic sketches from Queen Victoria's collection, works rarely revealed even within royal circles. That gesture was not about curiosity. It was about trust, a quiet passing of cultural intimacy from one generation to another, and trust, in royal history, is more valuable than any jewel. As the Queen's health became more fragile in her final years, attention naturally turned toward succession planning. But what remained largely unseen was emotional succession, who would carry forward the Queen's personal sense of meaning beyond titles and ceremonies. That question became more important than anyone realized, because within the palace, jewels are not simply distributed. They are assigned like memories. Each piece carries a story. Each necklace, brooch, and tiara hold a moment from history, a diplomatic visit, a coronation, a private anniversary, a symbol of continuity across generations. And in that silent language of symbolism, decisions began to reflect something deeper than protocol. Lady Louise, despite not holding a working royal role in the same way as senior members of the family, represented something increasingly rare within modern monarchy: distance from ambition. She was not competing for visibility. She was not shaped by media presence. She was not defined by public approval. Instead, she was known for something quieter: steadiness, discipline, and emotional restraint. It is precisely this kind of personality that, according to royal historians, often resonates most with monarchs who have spent their entire lives under public pressure. Because in a world of performance, authenticity becomes priceless. But while Louise represented quiet continuity, another narrative was unfolding alongside her rise within royal attention: the evolving role of Queen Camilla. Camilla, as queen consort, naturally occupies a position of high importance within the royal structure. Historically, the queen consort is expected to receive first selection of significant private jewels. This tradition reinforces continuity at the very top of the monarchy. And yet, tradition does not always erase complexity, because royal inheritance is never just ceremonial. It is emotional, political, symbolic, and often deeply personal. As reports and speculation circulated about private distributions of the Queen's collection, a subtle tension emerged in public interpretation. Not open conflict, not direct confrontation, but the kind of symbolic imbalance that royal watchers analyzed for years. Camilla, despite her position, entered a royal system already layered with established emotional connections. The late Queen's long relationship with the Princess of Wales, Catherine, also shaped expectations about visibility and inheritance of symbolic pieces. And within this intricate structure, every jewel became more than decoration. It became positioning. It became message. And then, unexpectedly, attention turned toward a quieter figure who seemed far removed from such competition. Lady Louise. What made her presence so unusual in this narrative was not ambition, but the absence of it. She did not seek symbolic inheritance. She did not publicly engage in royal positioning. She lived, in many ways, outside the traditional trajectory of power within the family. She even declined to use a Her Royal Highness title once she reached adulthood, a decision that surprised many outside royal circles. Instead of stepping into enhanced royal status, she chose a more grounded path, including academic life and ordinary work experience at a garden center, earning a modest wage like any other young adult. To the public, this seemed unusual. To Queen Elizabeth, it reportedly reflected something familiar, a sense of normalcy, a rejection of unnecessary performance, and in that simplicity, a rare kind of compatibility with the Queen's own private values. Because beneath the crowns and ceremonies, Elizabeth II was known for valuing something very specific in people around her: steadiness without spectacle, duty without demand, presence without noise. And Lady Louise, in her quiet way, reflected all three. This is where the story of inheritance becomes more symbolic than material. Because if jewels are memory, then their placement is never random. They are emotional markers. A necklace passed to one granddaughter can represent continuity of trust. A brooch gifted to another can signal recognition of service. And a carefully chosen piece can silently communicate what words never will. In royal history, symbolism often speaks louder than succession charts. But beyond jewels, there was another inheritance forming quietly in parallel: character, duty, continuity of behavior across generations. And here, Lady Louise begins to resemble not just a recipient of legacy, but a continuation of it. Her involvement in carriage driving, a discipline closely associated with Prince Philip, reflects more than sport. It reflects inherited interest, a shared rhythm of precision, patience, and control. It is no coincidence that Philip himself reportedly supported her interest deeply and personally, and it is within this context that the most emotionally powerful royal moments of recent years took place. The sight of Lady Louise driving her grandfather's carriage at public events was not just symbolic, it was deeply personal, a visual continuation of a relationship that existed beyond public titles. And for Queen Elizabeth, watching that moment was reportedly one of profound emotional resonance, not as a monarch, but as a grandmother witnessing continuity. This is where inheritance becomes something far more complex than distribution lists. It becomes memory in motion. Now, when discussing Camilla, Catherine, and other senior royals, the narrative often focuses on hierarchy. Who receives what? Who stands where? Who is prioritized in symbolic tradition? But within the private world of the Queen's final years, there was another layer operating beneath hierarchy: emotional alignment. And emotional alignment does not always follow rank. It follows trust, which brings the narrative back again to Lady Louise. Because while she is not positioned at the center of royal power, she occupies a different kind of space entirely, a space built on absence of expectation. And in monarchy, absence of expectation can sometimes carry more weight than presence of duty. As reports and interpretations of jewel distribution continue to circulate among royal analysts, one theme remained consistent. The Queen's choices were not purely traditional. They were deeply personal. Each decision, whether related to jewelry, heirlooms, or symbolic gifts, reflected not only hierarchy but affection, recognition, and private understanding. And in that deeply human framework, Lady Louise emerges not as a competitor in royal hierarchy, but as a quiet constant, a figure who was never shaped by ambition, never driven by public positioning, and never defined by external pressure. Instead, she represents something rare within modern royalty: continuity without noise, legacy without declaration, strength without performance. And perhaps that is why her presence within this larger conversation about inheritance feels so significant, because while crowns define authority and jewels define legacy, character defines endurance. And endurance is what survives long after ceremony fades. As the royal family continues into a new era, shaped by evolving roles, public scrutiny, and shifting traditions, the question of inheritance is no longer just about who receives what. It is about what kind of monarchy continues forward. And in that question, unexpected figures often matter most, not because they seek attention, but because they reflect something timeless beneath it. And in that silence, one truth becomes clear: the most powerful inheritance is not always held in jewels. Sometimes it is held in people who never needed them to shine. In the quiet corridors of royal history, there are moments that never reach the surface immediately. They do not arrive with announcements, press releases, or public ceremony. Instead, they emerge slowly, through patterns, through symbolism, and through the careful reading of what is left unsaid. And the story of Lady Louise Windsor and the Queen's private jewel collection is one of those moments. Not a single event, not a single decision, but a gradual unfolding of legacy, trust, and emotional inheritance that stretches far beyond what the public was ever meant to see. To understand the significance of what is believed to have taken place, one must first understand the emotional weight carried by royal jewels. They are not simply luxury items or historical artifacts. Within the monarchy, they function as a silent language, a language of memory, duty, recognition, and hierarchy. Some pieces represent power, some represent continuity, and some represent personal affection that never appears in official statements. The crown jewels belong to the institution itself, but the private collection of Queen Elizabeth II belonged to something more intimate. It was built over a lifetime, gift by gift, occasion by occasion, each piece tied to a specific moment, a specific relationship, or a specific emotional memory that cannot be replicated or replaced. This is why the question of who receives them matters so deeply. Because in royalty, inheritance is never just distribution. It is interpretation, and interpretations can reshape narratives for generations. As Queen Elizabeth's later years unfolded, the structure of the royal family was already changing. Roles were becoming more defined. Public responsibilities were shifting. And a new generation was stepping forward into visibility while another generation gradually stepped back. But behind this public transition, something more personal was being quietly finalized. The Queen was not only a sovereign, she was also a matriarch deciding how a personal world would be remembered. And in that private world, attention increasingly turned toward individuals who did not necessarily dominate headlines, but who reflected stability, loyalty, and emotional consistency. Among them was Lady Louise Windsor. Unlike many royal figures who grow into public prominence early, Louise's path was noticeably different. She was not shaped by media exposure or public expectation. Instead, she grew within a quieter framework, one that allowed her to develop away from constant scrutiny. This separation from public pressure became one of the defining features of her identity. And in royal environments, distance from pressure is often interpreted as something rare, not absence of importance, but absence of distortion. Because in the absence of public performance, personality is seen more clearly. Reports and observations from royal commentators over the years have consistently pointed to one defining characteristic of Lady Louise: her calm steadiness. Not theatrical, not performative, not driven by attention, but consistent in demeanor, discipline, and behavior. And in a family built on centuries of public duty, that quality carries unique weight. It echoes something familiar. It echoes the Queen herself. Queen Elizabeth II spent her entire life balancing visibility with restraint. She understood the cost of attention. She understood the discipline required to remain composed under constant observation. And she valued people who did not amplify noise around her role. Instead, she valued those who reduced it. This is where the emotional connection between the Queen and Lady Louise becomes more than just generational. It becomes reflective, a kind of silent recognition between two personalities shaped differently by age, but similarly by temperament. In private settings such as Balmoral, where formality often softens and family relationships become more visible, this connection was said to be most apparent. Away from cameras, away from official duty, relationships within the royal family often take on a more human form. It is within these environments that trust is not announced. It is observed and repeated and deepened over time. At the same time, the structure of royal inheritance continued its own traditional path. Queen Camilla, as Queen Consort, occupies a constitutionally significant position within the monarchy. By tradition, the Queen Consort is often given priority and access to significant pieces of the sovereign's private collection. The Princess of Wales, Catherine, also holds a deeply symbolic position within the future of the monarchy, and her visibility in ceremonial jewelry has already reflected the continuation of royal symbolism across generations. But within this structured hierarchy, something more nuanced exists. Because hierarchy in monarchy is official, but emotion is not. And emotion often influences decisions in ways that are never publicly documented. This is why speculation around the Queen's private collection became so compelling to observers, not because of confirmed inventories, but because of what such decisions symbolically suggest. Who is remembered? Who is trusted? Who is associated with continuity rather than position? And within that interpretive space, Lady Louise's name appears repeatedly in commentary not because of formal authority, but because of emotional proximity. A proximity shaped not by duty, but by familiarity. And familiarity, in royal life, is a currency of its own. One of the most discussed symbolic inheritances connected to Louise is her involvement in equestrian carriage driving, a discipline strongly associated with Prince Philip. This is not simply a hobby within royal tradition. It is a structured, demanding, and highly technical discipline that requires precision, control, and deep understanding of both animal and machine. Prince Philip himself was deeply invested in this sport, and his mentorship of Lady Louise added an emotional layer to her involvement. This is where inheritance becomes symbolic rather than material, because when Philip reportedly left her his carriage and related equipment, it was not merely a gift of objects. It was a transfer of continuity, a passing of personal identity through discipline. And the emotional weight of that gesture became even more visible during public appearances where Louise continued to participate in carriage driving events after his passing. One of the most striking moments occurred when Queen Elizabeth herself was seen watching Louise compete using Philip's carriage. Observers noted the emotional significance of the scene. A grandmother watching her granddaughter carry forward a tradition shared with her late husband. In that moment, inheritance was no longer theoretical. It was visible. It was moving. It was living. This is where the narrative of jewels and legacy begins to merge with something deeper. Because in monarchy, the most important inheritance is not always what is worn. It is what is continued. And continuation does not always follow hierarchy. It follows connection. Meanwhile, public discussion about Camilla's position within the royal jewel structure often reflects a different aspect of monarchy: institutional balance. As Queen Consort, her role is essential to the